George Zimmerman's defense attorney, Mark O'Mara. I want to go straight out to him. Thank you, Mark, so much for joining me.
Great seeing you again.
Good seeing you. I guess, you know, what many people want to know is, what is the first thing that went through your mind when you heard not guilty?
Well, you always want to hear those words as a criminal defense attorney. I've got to say that the way I looked at this case in the beginning was that it was full of self-defense. It truly was, with all the evidence we had of the injuries and whatnot. So while we're always worried what a jury is thinking, it really felt to me as though we had presented a good case, that the state had presented a very weak case for second degree or any crime. So I'm always worried right before the words are spoken, but I truly expected not guilty in this one.
Well, you know, talking about expectations, many people are talking about George Zimmerman not really showing much emotion throughout the entire trial, not showing much remorse. I think we have a clip of part of the George Zimmerman interview with Sean Hannity, in which he says that it was God's plan. Take a listen.
Is there anything you regret? Do you regret getting out of the car to follow Trayvon that night?
No, sir.
Do you regret that you had a gun that night?
No, sir.
Do you feel you wouldn't be here for this interview if you didn't have that gun?
No, sir.
You feel you would not be here?
I feel that it was all God's plan, and for me to second guess it or judge it.
Is there anything you might do differently in retrospect, now that time has passed a little bit?
No, sir.
So let's talk about that. I mean, does he still feel that way, that he would not have done anything differently?
Well, I've spoken to George about this several times because I know that it can come across to people who say that that's just insensitive, that most people would say, I would do anything different to avoid a tragic consequence like happened here. But I think what George was saying was that under the context of what he was going through, that he didn't make any decisions that were improper that he would change. And I really think that's what he was trying to get across. I have said several times in my life, if not more, when dealing with the loss of a loved one, from my mom passing, my dad passing, and a niece passed with cancer, that you sort of accept things by saying it's God's plan. It may well have come across somewhat insensitive, but I really think George, being a religious kind of guy, just looked at it and said, I have to accept this as God's plan.
Well, what about his reaction to the verdict? Because I was watching him, and you almost saw no reaction. Is that something that you counseled him to do? Why didn't we see more of a reaction?
Well, he really was counseled by Don and I, and he was also not admonished, but instructed by the judge, as was the rest of the audience, that there was to be no emotion whatsoever shown. And we told George, whatever the verdict, just sit as you have during the trial, be respectful of the process, be respectful of the judge, and be respectful of the Martin family, and just listen to the words, and we'll talk about it afterwards. And that's what he did.
Now, I have to ask you, I mean, you know, I was a federal prosecutor. I've been on the other side of the table from great defense attorneys, and sometimes we have really good relationships with you know, the other side, and sometimes not so good. It seemed to me that the relationship that you had with the prosecution's team here was really contentious. Can you speak to that?
Well, I've done this for 30 years, and I've done death penalty cases and a bunch of other contentious murder cases, but this was the first time in my career I filed one motion for sanctions against a prosecutor, and I think I filed 6. So it was very contentious. I think that they took a weak case for bad reasons. I think they were politically motivated in the way they took the case on. I'm very frustrated that they decided not to put it in front of a Seminole County grand jury that was waiting to hear the evidence, made a decision 6 days before Ms. Corey was up for re-election, and then hide the evidence the way they did with us. It took us hundreds of hours to get discovery that, Sonny, if I was against you as a federal prosecutor, you would have laid on my desk the first week we were involved with each other. And it took me 6 months to get a picture of my client's injuries. That's just not fair.
Yeah, you know, and I wonder about that. We heard you argue in court that really the prosecution was playing a game of hide the ball from the very beginning. And in particular, what was fascinating to me was your argument about Trayvon Martin's cell phone. The fact that you alleged that the prosecution didn't give you the text messages, didn't give you the pictures, and really hid the information from you. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. We found out that in January 23rd, 2013, that they had reports generated by their IT expert that was given to Bernie Delarianda in the presence of a couple of the other prosecutors. And they had that. And we know that now without question because Mr. Krudbos, the IT person who was fired last Friday, told us under oath that he had given those reports to them. We did not get those until June, and only after we filed motions, and then only after we had Bernie Delarianda say to the judge in response to her question that he had gotten no other reports and no other information. And that was just untruthful. When we finally got to the point of the hearing where I wanted Bernie Delarianda to take the stand, the judge sort of punted it and didn't put him on the stand, I think because had she actually had him testify and he say what he said, it would have been immediate contempt proceedings and it would have interfered with the trial.
You know, Angela Corey's office, of course, has responded, and they claim they have done nothing wrong. I want to let you listen to an interview that they did with HLN's Vinnie Politan, and they were asked basically what their reaction was to, or how would they describe George Zimmerman in one word. Take a listen to this.
One word to describe George Zimmerman.
Murderer.
George Zimmerman.
Lucky.
Mark, I have to get your reaction to that because Angela Corey, even though your client has been acquitted of second-degree murder, described him as a murderer. Bernie Delarianda described him as lucky. What is your response to that?
That it's disgusting that they would denigrate a jury verdict the way that they did. Our whole process is based upon the fact that we will trust citizens to decide our criminal cases, and for them to come in after the fact and denigrate the jury, thereby denigrating the whole process, and not accepting this verdict the way they would, only emphasizes the way they've treated this whole case, which is disrespect for everything that most lawyers hold near and dear.
Well, many people are saying that perhaps that was defamatory. Would you sue them?
Well, I think, I don't do First Amendment work, but when somebody has been determined by their peers to be innocent of a case, not guilty, for a prosecutor who is sworn to uphold the law and a jury's verdict to come in and counter that with slander or libel, yeah, if it's there, she should be responsible for it. I would like to say that this was unusual for her behavior or for the behavior of the prosecution team. I almost could have written the script if I just thought of the worst or inappropriate thing someone could have said. I might have come up with those words for them.
Well, let me ask you this then. When you think about Angela Corey, what's your one word?
See, I can't run into the garbage pile or the sandbox with her the way she did. Not the time, not the place for it. Very difficult prosecutor to work with discovery. I think she had motivations in the beginning of this case that had nothing to do with justice. They went in front of that jury, and the first thing they said in their voir dire was that they're seeking justice, and then they treat George Zimmerman the way they did during the discovery process. During the trial, they scream at a jury words that were never, in a way that were never spoken by George Zimmerman just to inflame passions. John Guy ends his closing argument by saying, look into his heart, which is a blatant request for sympathy, which you cannot do, and they do it. So at least they're consistent.
Well, what about sanctions? I mean, we have this pending sanctions motion against the prosecution team, and you mentioned that in all your 30 years, you've maybe done it one time, and in this case, you had to do it 6 times. Will you follow up with that?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to amend the motion because I think that there is, now that we don't have the deadline of the trial in front of us, then I think that it needs to be a more well-founded motion, which is going to include the history of everything else we had to go through to get us to the point, because we shouldn't look at the 6th event in and of itself. We should really look at the history of the efforts that they've done to try and keep information from us, particularly Brady information, which they know what it is and they know they're supposed to be giving it.
Well, when we come back, and please stay with us, I want to talk to you a bit about George Zimmerman, where he is now, and what the prosecution says was his lack of courage to take the stand.
Be glad to.
Welcome back. I'm Sunny Hostin in for Nancy Grace tonight, and joining me is George Zimmerman's defense attorney, Mark O'Mara. And Mark, I want to take up where we just left off and let you take a listen to what the prosecutor said about George Zimmerman recently.
I pray that he would have the courage to take the stand, but as we all well know, he's got the right not to, and he made that decision.
He was afraid to take the stand.
The proof is in the pudding. Did he take the stand?
Now, Mark, he also said at one time that he prayed that George Zimmerman had the courage to get on the witness stand. What's your reaction to that?
You know, I guess it's okay to say it after the fact. We all know that the client's decision not to take a stand is one of the most revered rights that you have in a criminal trial. And George exercised it not because he was afraid to speak. If he was afraid to speak, he would have, lawyered up the first time that an officer talked to him. George did what he thought was right in talking to the officers. Every time they asked him a question, every reenactment they wanted to do, he passed a CVSA, so we know he was telling the truth in that context. But it was a decision at the trial level that was a strategy decision, and I've said so before. I would only counsel my client in this case to consider taking the stand if I thought the state had proven their case and that George, by his testimony, had to counter something. The state never proved their case because they never had a case, and there was no reason to expose him to the vitriol that is now apparent coming from Miss Corey afterwards. Why take that risk when there was no purpose in it?
Now, it's interesting that you say that you counseled him, because I was in the courtroom and it seemed to me, Mark, that he wanted to take the witness stand. Is that accurate? Was my read accurate of that?
You're right on. He wanted to tell that jury what he did, why he did it, and what the position that he was put in, why he had to react that way that he reacted. He really did want to talk and want to give his side of the story, but you and I know, Sonny, as trial attorneys, that the consideration of putting a client on the stand is one you have to be very careful about, because you can do more harm than good. And in a case where it was so weak to begin with, it was just a strategy decision of not taking the chance or the risk. Had he not ever given statements, he would have testified without question. But with 6 statements already before the jury, courtesy of the state, there was just no reason to do anything else.
It's interesting you just mentioned that courtesy of the state, because many people are now, of course, Monday night quarterbacking, but saying, why did the state do that? Had the state not put those statements in, would George Zimmerman have testified? I
think if they had not put the statements in, that we would have had George testify. I haven't said that before, but I think that without his statements, then he did need to tell the jury his story as to why he did what he did. I mean, with self-defense, you have to look at it, and it has to be an affirmative belief that you're in reasonable fear of great bodily injury. That's got to come from George's mouth, maybe from the circumstances, but since it came from his mouth on 6 different statements and it was out there, the state decided to put them in for whatever reason, but it certainly made our decision a lot easier.
And very quickly, where is George Zimmerman now? Have you spoken to him? What is his reaction to the reaction of the verdict?
Well, he's still in hiding. He's still very worried. He is surprised that people didn't listen to the trial and understand that he did act in self-defense. I was a bit concerned or surprised, because I would have thought that people would have listened more. But unfortunately, people who have made up their minds about this case one way or the other are not going to change their mind because of the facts of the case. They already have their opinions set, and unfortunately it leads to more divide rather than less between us.
Well, stay right with us, because I want to talk about the nation's reaction to this verdict. I'm Sunny Hostin in for Nancy Grace tonight. Thank you so much for joining me. And with me is Mark O'Mara, George Zimmerman's defense attorney. And Mark, thank you so much for being here again.
It's good to be here.
Let me ask you, we just saw juror B37 talk about the verdict. And what was so striking, I think, to many people is she voted not guilty the minute she got into the jury room, but there were others. 1, second-degree murder, 2 for manslaughter, the other one also not guilty. Many people, my good friend Mark Garagos among them, says that you won this case at jury selection. What do you think about that?
You know, people say that a lot. I will tell you that I enjoyed jury selection. I thought that I connected with the jury a lot, and that is important so that they get a feel for where we're going and where we're going with the case. So I felt good about that. I think you get a good read in jury selection. I've never believed it's one there. I think you have to have people who will listen, who are intelligent, and I think that's the type of jury that we got through jury selection and the rest of the case.
Well, let me ask you about the elephant in the room. Everyone's talking about race. You have 5 white female jurors, 1 black Hispanic juror, and people are saying they brought racial bias into that jury room. They didn't connect with Rachel Jeantel. They connected with George Zimmerman. What's your reaction to that?
It's so difficult to really tell, and being a white guy, I'm not the guy to ask, because I'd rather that be answered by an African American or somebody who actually has a feel for what it's like to deal with it on a daily basis. But from this white guy's perspective, I think that they were intelligent in listening. There was definitely a disconnect with Ms. Jeantel, with the language concerns and with her attitude concerns. I don't know that that was because she was black. I think if she was white and acted that way or spoke that way, there would have been a disconnect. But it was so difficult dealing with the racial issues because we wanted to keep race out of it because I don't think it was appropriately put on it. Yet you can't look at this case and say that it's not a lot about race, or at least the reaction to it was a lot about race.
Do you think this case was about race?
On the outside of the courtroom, absolutely. On the inside of the courtroom, it wasn't.
Please stay with us.
Sure.
Welcome back. I'm Sunny Hostin in for Nancy Grace this evening, and joining me is Mark O'Mara, George Zimmerman's defense attorney. And Mark, I want to ask you, I mean, what is your reaction to this nationwide response to the verdict? People are protesting in the streets all over the country. The Attorney General has weighed in on this, and I think what was interesting to me, being a native New Yorker, I picked up the newspaper, and the New York Daily News had a cover yesterday. I hope you can see it, which was fascinating to me. I mean, it sort of talks about Emmett Till, James Byrd Jr., and then Trayvon Martin, lumping this incident into just the civil rights frame. What is your response to all of this?
Well, initially, I was very surprised because I thought the world, the universe, the nation looked at every moment of the trial, listened to it, understood that this was a true case of self-defense, understood that at the very least it was a tragic intersection of 2 people's lives that ended up in a death, but that it was not a racial event by everything that came out in that courtroom. So when I woke up the next day to all these protests, I was really surprised, but then I realized the people who have opinions in this case are not going to change them no matter what, and they just weren't going to change them based upon the facts in the case. It's unfortunate, but I think that's what happened. I was also quite surprised that the Justice Department came out and said that they were going to look into this. They started their investigation over a year ago when the FBI interviewed 40 people or so, and every one of them said that George Zimmerman was meek, mild, and absolute non-racist, sort of a provable non-racist. And I think that may have been a situation where they are placating some of the anger and trying to address it in a nice way, but I don't see a DOJ investigation moving forward with any speed whatsoever.
And if perhaps there are charges filed by the Justice Department, would you be defending George Zimmerman in a case like that?
Absolutely.
And what about future lawsuits? You know, people are discussing whether or not George Zimmerman may file a civil suit of his own. Is he going to do something like that?
We really haven't talked it through very much, and of course I've not had an in-depth conversation with George about the prosecutor's reactions and the inappropriateness of their reactions. That's probably closer to the top of my mind as to some type of redress than anything else. I know that George would rather just move on with his life. Unfortunately, that'll never happen. We'll see how the litigation goes and what we'll react to if anyone else files anything.
Well, I have to ask you this, because watching you day in and day out in the courtroom and getting this verdict, you have now landed in the land of famous attorneys, along with Johnny Cochran, Jose Baez, of defense attorneys that have gotten acquittals and really have gotten this reaction from the public. Where do you go from here, Mark O'Mara?
It's been very surprising. I don't know. Part of me wants to go back to my nice little practice. Part of me wants to, I'd love to be involved in some of the high-profile cases that are out there. Maybe I have some talents to offer. If I have one talent I'd like to use, it's maybe to keep some of the cases calm that otherwise would get outrageous, because I do not want our nation to lose faith and trust in the criminal justice system, and I'm worried about that.
Final thoughts. Give me your final thoughts about this case, about this verdict, about the reaction.
I'm very worried that somebody who said this last year, that no matter how this ends, it's not going to end well for America, that may come true. I'm very, very worried that we're not going to take an opportunity to have a realistic conversation about the criminal justice system, gun laws, the way young black males are treated in the system, because there's so much anger that we're moving to opposite corners of the sandbox, and that's a dangerous place for us to be at this time in our history.
Mark, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Great talking
I really
to you.
appreciate
the time.
Thank you.